Well, this week we're going to be looking at intelligence or lack of intelligence, depending on how you decide to look at it. I do want to remind you that this week you will also be writing a paper about a movie. We're going to be showing this documentary in class at 6:30, so please do try to get to class. There is only one copy of the intelligence movie available in the library, and it will not be available until Thursday. There are other instructors who use this. The documentary is available online through one website that I have found for free. I have put the link to that website online for you to find. What I do remind you though is that sometimes links go down, sometimes web pages go down. I cannot control if that documentary will be working or not working for you. So I highly recommend that you get to class this week and make sure that you do see the film on intelligence, which your paper is based on. So let's start with basically a definition of intelligence. And this definition is kind of very broad compared to what most people think. We talk about this global capacity to act purposefully and to think rationally and deal effectively with the environment. Wow, that's a bunch of I don't know, intangible stuff. So what is intelligence? Well, I can tell you right now, most of the psychology community still argues a lot about what the definition of intelligence is. We have come down to basically that intelligence is a global capacity, meaning is that it's very wide. It's not a single little thing. There's multiple things that go into it, and that it's more than just the stuff you know. That's a very narrow focus of intelligence. That basically it's your ability to function in the world. And your ability to function in the world has a lot to do with your ability to adapt as you go through your environments. And so that's sort of the concept of intelligence that we're going to use as a framework for our discussion of intelligence here today. Now, one thing that they do bring up to you is something called the G factor, and we'll notice this in the movie too, the G factor. The G factor is sort of this general overview of intelligence. It's the core of intelligence. The thing is that when we talk about a G factor, it can be broken down into many sub areas. So knowledge, memory, adaptation, logic, those are all sub factors of the G factor. And when we start talking about our intelligence tests later in this lecture, we are talking about a G factor intelligence test, not basically a specialty test that's only looking at one thing. But we will also talk about Howard Gardner in this lecture, and Howard Gardner is actually moving away from the G factor. Now, you will notice that this is probably not on your study guide, the 5 cognitive factors. So why is it in a slide? Well, because many of you are going into a field of study where these 5 factors will be discussed, or you're moving on to developmental psychology where these 5 factors are discussed, and they kind of think you had a basic introduction to it. So just a really quick kind of review of what these are, so for the folks who are moving forward, they will have at least heard it before. When we talk about the 5 cognitive factors, we're talking about what are the 5 things that we think really make up intelligence. And the first one is fluid reasoning. And for many of you, you may also think of this as processing speed. So how fast can you bring in new material and then adapt to that new material or to that new knowledge? And processing speed, as you know, when you're little, seems to be really good. You're like a sponge. You seem to absorb everything. Mostly our fluid reasoning stays somewhat, steady throughout our 20s and 30s, and we begin to see slight declines as we get a little older in life. So unfortunately, we are kind of on a steady downhill after our 20s. However, it's usually not very noticeable. When we begin to see a real decline, a steeper decline, generally is in our late 70s. And for some people, it may not even be till their 80s. But what happens in our late 70s or 80s is we get these tangles in our brain. And because of the tangles, we believe right now, the hypothesis is that it just slows down the brain's ability to take in new information. Now, this doesn't mean we can't take in new information. It doesn't mean that we don't want to take in new information. It just may take us a little longer to get that new information in. We also have to understand that as we're getting into our late 70s and into our 80s, at least as of right now, we are also seeing certain areas of the brain beginning to die out. And so we may find that things don't work as well as it did before. So between having a slightly slower down brain and certain areas of our brain beginning to die out or not function as well as it did before because of the aging process, we can begin to think that our older citizens are perhaps not as functionable as they were. The truth is that most of them are just as functional as they were before, but what we do is we talk to them very loudly, thinking they can't, if we talk louder, they can understand better. And really what you need to do is slow down a little bit. But don't slow down to baby talk. Okay, Miss So-and-so, let's go. Oh, that's patronizing. But I might want to put a few gaps in my speech and bring it down to a slightly slower time frame so that the brain has that opportunity to absorb those words. If I go back up to full speed and I'm talking like this, even you can have a hard time sometimes following what I'm saying because I go so fast. And you have brains that have not yet started to slow down. So if you're working with an older population, and we are talking 75 and older, one of the things you could do is just slow down your speech a little bit, and you would find that they understand you so much better. Now, the book calls this next section knowledge. Really, the truth is that most people who study the brain will call this crystallized intelligence. It's basically the same thing. Well, crystallized intelligence is your encyclopedia, and that only gets better as we get older. If you think about it, that makes sense because you've had more experiences, you've seen more things, you've learned more things, you've experienced more things. So our encyclopedia, our dictionary will get larger and larger as we get older. Now, quantitative reasoning has to do with logic and problem solving. And we say the word quantitative because we think of numbers, and numbers are part of logic. But that one is one that we find to be somewhat the best in the middle of our lives. And it's also one reason why you may find that math is a little easier for you to do now than it was back when you were in high school, because you now have crystallized knowledge, which means you've had some experience with this, and your quantitative reasoning is a little better right now, and you may find that math is actually easier for you now. Visual spatial processing, this is our hand-eye coordination, and we do know that there was a slight difference at birth between boys and girls, and we've talked about the fact that you got to get the girls out there playing basketball, playing soccer, anything that has a hand-eye coordination, just throwing things through hula hoops, anything that requires hand-eye coordination. If we get those girls out there early in life, and we are talking about before kindergarten, and they're doing it on a somewhat regular basis, no, you don't just take them out once and say, oh, here's my one time. No, we got to do it on a regular basis. Then we're going to find that she's going to develop the exact same synapses as a boy, and she will stay equal to a boy throughout the rest of her life. Now, working memory, this is part of short-term memory. When we did our stuff on memory, we talked about the fact that there were two basic functions for short-term memory. One was temporary storage, but the other was thinking. So think of working memory as our thinking part. And working memory, it adjusts throughout our lifetime too. It's not so much that it gets better or worse, we just use it differently. When we are very small, we don't have real great working memory. And then as we hit our sort of junior high, our late elementary school time, we begin to develop some heuristics, which is really a fancy term for figuring out how we can remember things or figuring out problems. As we develop those heuristics, or sort of that rule of thumb, you might want to say, we use those to help us work through our daily lives. And a lot of you have sort of a rule of thumb. It takes about 5 minutes to go do this. Oh, it'll take me about, to do that. And so we use a lot of those, and that's our working memory. Now, two words I always bring up here is reliability and validity. This comes back to any time of testing, and right now I know we're looking at this and we're thinking again academic testing, but my chefs and my IT people, we talk a lot about reliability and validity of your testing. Think about it. We have to have a reliable oven if we're talking about cooking. If our oven isn't reliable, that means is that we can't really cook well. So what is reliability? Basically, we're going to get the same score on a test each time we take that test. So again, we'll go back to our chefs. What are we testing? We're testing the temperature of the oven. We're putting a thermostat in there. So our expectation is that when the oven says it's 700 degrees and we use our thermometer, that we're going to get the same score of 700. 700 on the outside, 700 on the inside. Well, if we get a different score, then the question is the oven unreliable or is the testing measurement unreliable? And so we would have to go and determine that. With our computer folks, reliability is something that's really used a great deal. Are you basically going to say this computer system is reliable because every time I send a message down the system, I'm trying to send it to my boss actually gets the message? So we would say, well, that email system is pretty reliable. However, if I send the email and it goes to Timbuktu and to some guy named Sam, maybe my email system isn't so reliable. With the medical field, reliability is really going to come back more toward our medical equipment. Let's think about a diabetic, and we have diabetic testing machines. Well, we would want to make sure that every time that we took a measurement of how much blood sugar or glucose is in somebody's body, that we knew that this machine was giving us a reliable reading. How do we do that? Well, we have some liquid which we know is always at 100. The score should be 100. So if I take my meter and I take a little bit of this solution and my meter reads 120, well, maybe my meter isn't so reliable because it should come out at 100. So maybe I take it and I test it again, and next time I get a score of 100. Well, now is it my meter or was it the thing that I was using to read the meter, these little sticks that you have? So reliability is something that we spend a lot of time on. And in psychology, we're doing the same thing. We wouldn't want to give a test where each time we took the test, we saw such different scores, even though the people are very much the same, or even on the same person. Let's think about something like the SATs. I go take it, and one time I've got 1,000. The next time I take it, I get a 500. And then I think, oh my God, I'm trying to get better, not worse. So I go back, I take it again, and I get a 700. Well, how reliable is that test score? I'm all over the place. So we look at reliability. Now, validity in psychology, and and what we're doing, says, are we measuring what it claims to measure? So why would I give you a typing test if I wanted to see if you could spell? And we'd say that wasn't a very valid test, was it? Learning to type does not correlate to your ability to spell. So validity has to do a lot more with making sure that we're getting back sort of what we're putting out there, that we're measuring the same thing. Well, again, with these other things that we're doing, other fields, we're looking a lot at the validity. So would I take a urinalysis test when I really want to look at blood sugar? No, because the urine isn't going to really show me the blood sugar because the blood needs to be there for blood sugar. For a chef, I always like to talk about the mysterious measuring cup. Sometimes when there's a glass cup, I've been told that even though you pour the milk into it the way that the cup has been made, it doesn't always show whether or not you actually have a cup of milk. It could make it look, depending on how you have it on the counter, like you have more than a cup or less than a cup. So you would stop using that measuring cup because it wasn't very valid. It wasn't giving you the same measurement each time. So validity says it should be measuring what it says it's measuring. Now, when we talk about tests, we really talk about the fact there are three kinds of tests that we have out there. An aptitude is basically your ability to do something. So the first one would be a specialty aptitude test, and that would be your psychology exams. Those are specialty aptitude tests, and that predicts whether or not you're successful in a single area. And if you think about it, I'm testing you only on certain chapters. So how much of that certain chapter do you know? How well would you be able to do in that? With a multiple aptitude test, we are testing two or more types of ability. So this would be something like the SATs, where it's looking at your reading, your writing, and your arithmetic. This might be like the Army test, where they go in and they look at your physical fitness and something else. Then there is the general IQ tests, and they're testing your G factor. Now, general IQ tests have a wide range of mental abilities, and those people who think they've taken an IQ test, for most of you, really haven't taken a standardized IQ test. Very rarely have I really found people who've taken the IQ test. Those generally take 3 days, by the way. They're done over a 3-day period. Each session is an hour to an hour and a half. They do everything from paper to pencil to blocks to other things. So a general IQ test is a very detailed test, and it's not looking at just one area or two areas of your knowledge. It's looking at your huge area of knowledge. So when we talk about IQ tests, we have to talk about the fact that there are two big ones. The Stanford-Binet is the first one that we're going to talk about. Right now we're on the 5th edition. This is Mr. Binet himself, Alfred Binet, and we kind of look at him because he's sort of the first one to make an intelligence test. And he was interesting dude. He was French, and the French government had basically come to him and said, find a way to help us find our brightest and our smartest, because back in the day when he was doing this, the French didn't have the money to educate every child. This was still a very rural country. Even in the United States, we're very rural, and we couldn't take children off the farms because they were needed on the farms. I mean, somebody who is 15 or 16 years old is extremely capable of working multiple areas in the farm, and we need them to work those areas in order to produce enough food for everybody to eat. So if we're going to be taking somebody from the farm, then we need to really make sure that they are the best and the brightest. But we can't wait until they're 15 to take them from the farm. We need to start earlier. So we won't want to put a lot of resources into somebody to find out that basically they weren't going to be of help to society, because the French had limited money and limited resources to do this. So they said to Binet, go figure some way out. And he did. And he comes up with the concept of mental age, which we'll talk about here in just a few moments when we get to actually IQ scores. But he's a very smart man. Now, what happens is after Binet dies, Stanford University takes over this testing and keeps the test alive. So that's why it's called the Stanford-Binet. Now, the other one that you hear a lot about is the WESH, or the Wechsler, and this is for adult intelligence testing. The Stanford-Binet tends to work more for children. This is the one that we tend to use for kids. It is pretty much like the Stanford-Binet in that it does yield a single overall intelligence score. It also will develop these separate scores, and one reason I don't talk about it in the Stanford-Binet is because they're very much the same. So if I'm going to be taking this intelligence test, I will get the single score, which we call IQ. But the truth is that with a true intelligence test, we're also going to be looking at verbal and nonverbal abilities. So what's going to happen is we're going to be looking at things like problem solving versus our ability to understand language and symbols. And we get separate scores for all of those. And the reason that it's important for us to get separate scores for all of that is that we might be able to use this as a way to determine if there is something wrong with somebody's intelligence, or where there may be a lack or a special ability within someone's intelligence. The truth is that the IQ score is a sort of overall score, but if I'm looking at this, we would expect someone to basically be about the same throughout all of their scoring. But if I'm looking at them and they're kind of high, and then they dip really low, let's say on the verbal part of the test, and they come right back up, well, that might give us an idea of what's going on with this person, that there's something wrong with the verbal part of their intelligence. And that could actually be a physical problem. They could have an ear problem. They could have something wrong within their brain. But it would tell us that there's something unusual going on here. So we want those separate scores along with the overall score. So let's talk about IQ. This is the big thing that people mostly talk about. And IQ is divided into this formula: mental age divided by chronological age times 100. And this is the Stanford-Binet test. This is the one that he came up with. And this is generally the IQ score also in the Wechsler. But what is mental age? That's the average intelligence that somebody has at a certain age. So let's just use this as sort of a pretend. Don't hold me to this. But let's say that I went out and I questioned a whole bunch of 4-year-olds, and I wanted to know how far they could count to. And so the average 4-year-old could count to the number 5. Then I went out and tested a whole bunch of 5-year-olds, and I found out that the average 5-year-old could count to the number 10. Then I went out and found 6-year-olds, and I said, okay, how high can they count to? And I find out that the average 6-year-old could count to the number 20. So 4-year-olds can count to 5, 5-year-olds can count to 10, and 6-year-olds can count to 20. Those would we say are their average scores. So that's what a person of that age should be able to do. So I'm going to give you a test. And let's say that you could count to 10. So you are chronologically 5 years old, but your mental age would also be 5. Because remember, we said a 5-year-old could count to 10 and you could count to 10. So we would take your chronological age and your mental age, 5 by 5, and 5 divided by 5 is 1. Now, the reason we have the 100 here is because Binet didn't like decimals. Most people don't like decimals. So you multiply by 100 to get rid of the decimal. And we would find out that the IQ score was 100. And that's pretty much the same for most IQ tests, that the average exact middle person is going to be 100. But let's say that when I asked the next 5-year-old to count, they could count to 20. Well, they have a higher mental age because we said that the average 6-year-old could count to 20 and this person could count to 20. So we'd say mentally they are 6. Chronologically, they are 5. And if we multiply times 100, we get 120. So the question is are we saving for Harvard for this person? Don't quite know yet. And we go to the next 5-year-old and we say, please count, and they can only count to the number 5. We did say that the average 4-year-old could only count to the number 5. So when we look at this person, they have a mental age of 4, but remember, they were 5 years old, and we multiply times 100, and they get an 80. So again, the question comes, are they riding the little yellow bus? We don't know yet. The truth is that these scores are just scores. They don't really tell us much because we don't compare them to anybody else. We don't know if somebody who is 6 is outstanding in our community and somebody who is 4 is really problematic. We won't know unless we look at a whole bunch of people. That's where this comes in. This right here is called the bell curve, and you'll see this in your book. And basically, when we talk about IQ scores, we're talking about where do you fit on this curve. Now, this curve has been developed based on having lots and lots and lots of people take IQ tests. Now, this is the only time I really say that you're going to really need to look at two different things. For IQ, the Binet and the Wesch have two different ranges, and you kind of need to know both because it depends on what field you're going into on whether or not the one that they use is the Wesch or the Binet. In the Binet, basically 85 to 115 is considered to be normal, so between these two lines. And that makes sense because we're talking about the average score. Notice that most people score between these two lines. Average is not a single number of 100, it is actually between two numbers. So we're going to find out this is about 68% of the population fits in here. Now, what's nice is that both on the Wesch and the Binet, we're going to find that gifted is at the 130 mark, right here. So what was 120? 120 was sort of bright. We're a little better than the average bear. I don't know if we're saving for Harvard, but we're going to find school maybe just a little average than anybody else. Now, mental retarded is at 70 for the Binet and 60 for the Wesch. Basically, for the Wesch, they kind of call it a borderline, where down here they call it retarded. For the Binet, it's at 70. I would always just kind of remember 70 is getting down there in range. And so we say anybody who's got a 70 or lower is probably going to be labeled as mentally retarded. Although the new terminology is mentally challenged. There are kinds of different names that are being put out there today, but we are saying that this is less than basically 2% of the population. So when we're down in this low area, we really are seeing a very small percent of the population. And you can also see over here when we get to the 130 area, we're seeing a very, again, small population of people. By the way, they call this very superior, but for most of us we'd call it genius, and genius is generally about the 145 range or above, and that's less than 1% of the population of people. So what's here in red is what you need to write down for your notes. Yeah, you kind of need to know what the average range is for both the Wesch and the Binet, and you also need to know where gifted is and where mentally retarded is. When you take your test, it will be giving you which one I'm asking for. We're going to say according to the Binet or according to the Wesch. And so you would need to know that. Those of you going into the healthcare fields, this is sort of a memorize and regurgitate type of thing. You really need to know this. For the rest of you, the reason that you really want to know this is that when someone talks to you about the IQ of your child, you do want to ask, were they given the Wesch or the Binet? And you might find that they were not given either one, which means that all these scores are out the door. You need to ask, what is the average score range? And I bring this as an example. I have a lovely friend who I really enjoyed, and one day she called me up. She said, I can't believe it. My child just got her IQ score back. It's 196. Now, 196 on the Wesch or the Binet is beyond genius. It's less than 0.5% of the population. It's such a small amount of people who've got an IQ at that level. We are talking Albert Einstein didn't have an IQ that high. So while I like my friend and I like my friend's daughter, she was not smarter than Albert Einstein. So I kind of just gently said, what test did she take? And it was not one I had heard of before. And I said, we need to go find out what the range of the scores were. Well, what we found out was that the average score, the exact middle score, so right here, coming down this line, was 200. My friend's kid had a 196, which means she was right smack dab in the middle of being average. And that's who she was. She was an average intelligence child. She wasn't the best. She wasn't the worst. She was very much in the middle as far as IQ was concerned. So understand that IQ is simply a number that's given after a formula, but you would need to understand the formula to understand the IQ, and then to understand the IQ score, you need to have a bunch of people who've taken that test to understand if my score is good, bad, or indifferent. A lot of people ask me about the stability of IQ, and I always like to bring this in. IQ is not stable before 6 years old. We really don't like to give IQ tests before 6, primarily because the brain is developing at such different rates for such different children. And where you might have a child who at 4-year-old shows kind of a low IQ, by the time they get to 6, they could be average to above average. It just may be that their brain took a little bit longer to develop. We especially see this with children who may be seeming to be excelling or so much brighter than every other kid. They were at that point, and we're not saying that they aren't bright children, but maybe their brain just developed a little bit faster. So it's really in kindergarten and first grade where we're really going to begin to pick up those kids who really are showing that they have superior brains. Their aheadness stays the same. So let's say I get a little kid who can come into kindergarten and they can read a book. Well, the question is, are they reading bigger and better books at the end of kindergarten, or are they reading sort of the same level of books? If they're reading sort of the same level of books, that just simply means they picked up reading earlier, and the other kids caught up to them. But if they started with kindergarten books in kindergarten, and at the end of kindergarten they're reading third grade books, then yeah, they've continued to have this gap between the other children and them, and that's a better sign that they may have a superior intelligence. So we don't really do many IQ tests before 6 years of old. Even at 6, we really don't like giving IQ tests, but somewhere in first, second grade we'll begin to give IQ tests. And so we already talked about fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence, and that's a lot of why we don't do a lot of IQ testing to young children, because that changes. Now, a gifted child is generally considered somebody who has a 130 or above as far as an IQ, but notice they can also have a special talent or ability. So Mozart, who was playing not only at 5 years old, but writing music very early on. One of the biggest problems with gifted children is that we often don't test that giftedness. Meaning is that we'll be glad to give them an IQ test, but an IQ test doesn't magic your or measure your musical ability. And you've met the kids who can hear a song, go over to a piano, and start playing it. They've never had a music lesson themselves, but they can pick out the notes and they begin to get it. Isn't that intelligence? It is, but we don't actually here in the United States test that. Or a child who can do absolutely fabulous drawings when they're young and reproduce things. An athletic child who can do something very young. These are all gifted children, but they may not come through on standardized IQ tests. And the other thing is that we need to make sure that you understand that being gifted or not gifted, it doesn't matter either way. Successful people are people who are persistent and motivated to learn. That success in school and success in life is about persistence and motivation to learn. Think about how many people start a class and are not there at the end of the class. And why are they not there? They were not perhaps persistent in getting here, persistent in keeping doing it, or they may have lost their motivation to learn. And that's what we really see is the absolute necessity for success in life. If you have an average IQ at least, then it's all about your persistence and your motivation. In fact, most people who get perfect SAT scores are not gifted children. They are actually within the average intelligence, but they made this a goal. They made it something that they were going to do. They wanted to get a really high IQ score, a really high SAT score, and they worked at it, and they were persistent about it, and they studied for it, and they were able to do it. Then the other question is can we blame my parents for my IQ? Or do I get to blame the environment I was raised in? At this point, basically, it's pretty much a combination. Part of it's going to be what you inherit, and part of it's going to be your upkeep or how you were brought up. How do we know this? Well, because we've done a lot of testing, we've done a lot of research into what's going on, and we've discovered a couple of things. First of all, your social economic status is probably going to be the thing that directly relates to your IQ the most. The higher your social economic status, the higher your IQ generally is. And we find that even with children who are adopted, they're adopted out of a low social economic status, then they tend to get a higher IQ than their biological parents. But they don't always match their adopted parents. When we come to early childhood education, we also find that the better the earlier childhood education is, the higher the IQ scores will be. This is why programs like the Head Start programs got started, was because we would find children who were coming out of households where the parents were uneducated, they were illiterate. And how could this child succeed if the parents themselves were illiterate? That means that the parents couldn't teach their kids their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s before they came to school. And yet all the other kids knew their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s before they came to school. So what we will find is that getting these children into Head Start programs where they get basically the same start as the other kids that they're going to be going to school with has had a direct impact on their IQ. So that's sort of the environment part. However, we'll come back to the adopted one where it says children adopted out of low social economic statuses experience IQ gains. What we do find, though, is that in the long run, the adopted child will still be closer to their biological parents than they will be to their adopted parents as far as IQ is concerned. So what we basically say is that your parents kind of give you a beginning point, and then your environment's going to take you from there. Now, what we're going to talk about here at the end is Howard Gardner. And Howard Gardner, this gentleman right here, and is going to be a focus of the video that we're going to be watching. And he's really kind of come forward and been touting a theory that over the last 25 years or so has really sort of gained popularity. When I first heard about Howard Gardner, he wasn't even in the psychology books. And then he started in the back of the chapter. And then he became one of those boxes that are highlighted. And now in many books, when textbooks and we start studying about intelligence, we actually find him in the beginning of the chapters. But basically what Howard Gardner said is that we can't look at one G. We cannot look at one specific type of intelligence. That really intelligence is broken down into many sections, and to look at it as only being one part really does not allow us to bring in all the different types of intelligences there are. And he really breaks it down into these different areas of intelligences and really says that what we need to do is begin to develop testing procedures to allow us to understand these different areas of intelligence. And what he always states is that we have to look at also the cultural area that we're talking about. I mean, culturally, that here in the United States, book knowledge is considered to be pretty much what intelligence is. And yet if we take somebody who is extremely good with book knowledge and we were to put them down in, I don't know, Peru, the question is would they be able to survive well? Because in the back areas of Peru, what you really need to understand is how to farm and animal husbandry and planting. And this person with a lot of knowledge who could develop a nuclear power plant, the truth is that they might starve because they have no idea how to plant something. And so they may not be seen as very smart. They may have seen as sort of useless, whereas the farmer who knows how to produce really good fields, no matter what the weather is and the different grains, is considered to be the smart person, because that's the intelligence that's needed there. So Gardner kind of goes through these different ones. The first one he talks about is language, and that's your ability to use language. And you've met those people who can just write like a phenom, and you just get annoyed at them because we struggle with our papers, and there they are just writing them very easily. These are also, though, people who can use verbal language, and so a lot of our politicians are very high in language. Logic and math, I don't think I have to say too much about that one. But visual and spatial, this is really our engineers. And it's kind of really interesting that when I meet some of the engineers and artists, they can really understand just how far it is from this place to this place. Anybody who does a lot of measuring for their livelihood, like guys who come in and measure for your carpet, they can almost walk in a room and tell you exactly what the size of that room is without even really measuring. They, of course, would double check themselves by using a measuring tool. But that's what we're talking about with this. Music, we just went to that one. Musical abilities. Body kinetics is your physical body abilities. So we might talk about gymnasts. If we look at a gymnast on the Olympics, they might be the geniuses of body kinetics. They have to understand how they minutely twist or turn their body, which means they need to understand exactly how to move that specific muscle to get them to twist and turn in the air. They also have to know where they are in the air and exactly how much grip they have to have in order to do whatever it is that they're doing. Me, I can't even walk down the hallway, so I'd be mentally retarded in that one. Interpersonal versus intrapersonal. Interpersonal is talking about me with other people, where intra is getting our self-knowledge. How well do you understand yourself? This is kind of an interesting one because some of you who did the personality experiment found, maybe your intrapersonal was not as knowledgeable as you thought. Or what happens is that the interpersonal part of this, your interaction with others, turns out to be much different than you think. But you've met the people who have interpersonal skills. They just seem to get along with everyone. They can walk into a party and people just all seem to like them. It's not so much that they have this charisma as much as they have these really good social abilities. And then the naturalist, I wish I had this one. These are the people who animals just seem to come to, and they're never afraid of them. But they're also the people who seem to understand what's going on in nature. And so we could kind of go back to that theorist who learned all about nuclear power plants versus the farmer in Peru. Well, to be successful in Peru, to be intelligent in Peru, you need to have a pretty high naturalistic intelligence, wouldn't you? And you'd also have to have probably pretty good visual spatial and some body kinetics, because you'd have to be able to work those things out. Now, the other thing that they might need is some logic in their math, because they have to understand how much seed they have and how much water they have to have. So now we come back to our guy who is the nuclear physicist. He probably has to have some really good language abilities to be able to communicate. He has to have really good logic and math abilities to run that power plant. He probably also has to have some good intrapersonal. So he has to understand when he's scared or when he's not, and when that little voice inside of his head says, I don't know, something's up. So what would happen is that different people would have different levels of abilities, and that we really need to test for that. And that if we understood how people were in multiple intelligences, then we might be able to help direct them to areas that they would learn best in. So again, I remind you, on Tuesday, we're going to be watching that film about intelligence, which your next paper is due on, and I will be happy to see you then.